What's up? I'm Troubleshoot. Welcome back to another video. In this quick one, I'll be showing you how to optimize Avatar Frontiers of Pandora to get the game looking as good as possible while maintaining a really good frame rate. This video is not going to cover Windows optimization at all. Instead, in the description down below, you'll find a Windows 10, 11, and NVIDIA optimization guides. Instead, we'll be hopping straight into the game itself. Landing on the main menu, you can see we're sitting at around 50 FPS at 2K on a 3080 Ti, which doesn't bode too well, but the game is absolutely cranked right now. While you could technically optimize in this screen here, I'd recommend heading into the game and then getting at least through the interim so you can get to the outside areas here. The weather isn't the most favorable at the moment, but it does mean that there's a lot going on, and as you can see, we're sitting at a solid 40 FPS, 2K with a 3080 Ti, which says a lot. This game is set to extreme currently, so this is kind of the benchmark of where we are right now. When I fired up the game for the first time, so escape, settings, graphics, the game was set to high rather than ultra, so I'll apply these settings here and give you a preview of what this looks like. This is the high settings, and we've moved up from 40 to 55 FPS. Pretty good, and with a minimal visual impact. Heading to medium, all the way up to 62 FPS, which isn't as big of a jump from extreme to high, and finally from medium to low, 66ish FPS. So there seems to be quite big diminishing returns as you put the graphics preset down. Extreme gives you the worst FPS and high gives you a huge improvement, but everything below that doesn't really get you too much. So we'll start on the video tab here. Windowed mode, I'd recommend setting to full screen and setting the correct resolution, refresh rate, and aspect ratio down here that all match your native monitor settings. Anything more and you're pushing pixels you don't see, anything less and your game is going to be needlessly blurry for a small performance increase if anything. Then looking down further, you'll have temporal upscaler. For this we have AMD FSR3 as well as NVIDIA DLSS and TAA. TAA is the built-in upscaler for the engine. AMD FSR3 is a really good option to choose here. And finally, NVIDIA DLSS. I can't really see the number off to the side, so it may just be DLSS 1. In this case, I'd absolutely recommend AMD FSR3, which is the middle option here. If you have AMD FSR3 selected, you'll have the ability to use frame generation. Whether this works on my 3080, I don't think so. Let's see, could not release. Yeah, could not release. No, this has to do with my overlay. All right, so I think we'll need to have frame generation turned off as we aren't able to generate extra frames when I'm using an FPS overlay that hooks into the game. That's an interesting note. I'd definitely recommend having this turned on unless you get an error and the thing turns off. Anyways, having frame generation on should give you a higher FPS number, but it won't make the game feel any smoother really. Essentially, it generates frames in between real frames, which won't improve your input latency and stability and things like that. It'll only really improve the smoothness of how the game looks rather than feeling. So, while it may smooth things out, it's not necessarily going to help you if you're experiencing a laggy input and slowed game. As we're optimizing this, I'd recommend having frame generation turned off for the best, most consistent FPS results, and eventually when you're done, head back here to turn on frame generation. Then, scaling quality. For all upscalers, we can choose between quality and performance settings. The further to the left or the further to the performance side you push it, the lower the game resolution will be and the more AI has to work to upscale. If the game has to push too far for the performance side, you'll find weird graphic artifacts, glitches, and things that aren't supposed to be there are suddenly appearing. I'd recommend leaving this on ultra quality if not quality, and that's it. You should absolutely use this setting here instead of changing your resolution at the very top to give you the best looking game while keeping similar performance. Then scaling mode. For this, I'd recommend just leaving it at biased. Then VSync, I'd absolutely recommend turning off unless you're getting screen tearing, for which we have multiple options on the far right. Then frame rate limiting. I'd recommend turning this on surprisingly when we're done optimizing to lock your frame rate to slightly below the FPS you're getting in-game, for which you'll need to use the Steam overlay or third-party FPS overlay software so that you leave some of your GPU available for your system. The one thing that I noticed is that when I fired this game up, my YouTube videos and everything paused as it's just eating that much of my system. So I'd definitely recommend having frame rate limiting turned on, otherwise everything else will slow to a crawl on your system, including recording software, etc. For now, I'll leave it set to off, and I'd recommend you do too, as when we're finally done optimizing, lock your frame rate to slightly slightly below what you're getting, and or enable frame generation here. Cool. We'll apply our settings, and now the only change we really made was playing in full screen mode. So I'll double check. There we go. Full screen mode. Not much else has changed. Full screen mode, and for some reason scaling mode is turned off. I'll set this to biased and ultra quality, apply, and there we go. Right, FSR is working again, and now we're full screen. So heading back to the actual game itself, you'll see it looks pretty much indistinguishable, and we're at a 65-ish FPS. Good. We'll pause, head to settings, and onto the graphics tab at the very top, where we'll start with the preset. What I'd recommend you do is you set this to probably the closest to match your system. So in my case, I fired up the game and it had it set as high. That's where I'll start. So I'll apply settings, keep changes, and have a look at what kind of FPS we're getting. The game looks marginally better, and we're setting it around 56-ish FPS. We'll pause, settings, graphics, and start from the very top. First of all, motion blur. This is, for the most part, a single-player game, but it is somewhat a Far Cry-esque shooter, so motion blur may be a disadvantage if you have it enabled, or of course, if you suffer with motion sickness, this is definitely something you should disable. Personally, I play most games with motion blur disabled, and I'd recommend you do the same unless you like how it looks. This is your preference, and the same goes for depth of field. Personally, having this option pushed too high makes me feel like I need glasses, and this is something I usually lower. As you can see with the preview on the far right, depth of field off gives you the most clear vision, off into the distance. Low makes everything blurry, and high makes everything blurry but not as much. Some things are better to see in the distance. It's just a higher quality blur that doesn't do too much. It has a good middle ground. In this case, I'd recommend choosing either high if you want depth of field, or off if you don't want it at all. Scrolling down, shadows. Obviously, there's going to be tons of shadows cast by objects all over the map, so the fewer shadows, the more FPS you can expect. As for quality, you see there are multiple quality settings here. Very low looks far too clean. We need at least some blur in the shadows to make them look realistic, and low applies these. As you see, the further to the right we push this, the more detailed shadows get, and the more shadows we get with small objects and things like that. Personally, I'd recommend leaving this on low, if not medium, to keep a good performance/quality compromise. Sun contact shadows. Once again, clicking through these here, you can see it has a ambient occlusion type effect where objects cast better shadows on nearby objects. For the most part, between off and low, there's a big difference. You can see general shadows on the foliage on the ground, but pushing it to medium and high, there's pretty much no difference between these, except for a bit of the shadow on the sticks. For the most part, low is good enough here, but you can crank this up if you need it. Spot shadows has to do with light from light sources, I'm pretty sure. You can see for the most part, low, paying attention to the third little aircon/box there, and the middle light at the very top, the railing there, you'll see there's a small difference between these. This option has very minimal impact, except for high. As you can see between medium and low, there's only a few shadows that change. Medium has probably a more realistic look, but if you pay attention to the huge building on the left of the image here, you can see a shadow appears underneath it when it's set to high and nowhere else. This adds a lot more depth to the image, and I'd highly recommend leaving this on high for the most deep feeling/realistic looking gameplay experience. I wouldn't have this any lower. Spot shadows resolution is how detailed the textures are for shadows, and for the most part, on the low end, everything gets super blurry and you can't really tell what shadow's coming from what. Medium, there's a bit more detail added, and this is sort of playable here. High, there's much more detail, for example, leaf shadows and things like that. And extreme, it's as crispy as possible and looks as good as possible. If we click between these, you'll see there's a general change in how that overall image quality looks. The higher end this is, the better the game is going to look and feel. For the most part, high seems about good for me in terms of quality, and losing a few FPS for higher quality shadows is probably not going to be something you'll lose sleep over, but this is an option you can lower if you so prefer. Shadow proxies, if we have this enabled or disabled, it doesn't really matter. Essentially, enabling this uses less detailed shadow rendering, and of course will improve your FPS quite dramatically. However, the quality of shadows can suffer. For the most part, there's a very small difference between on and off. Having this turned on should give you better performance with shadows. Then scrolling down, reflections. In here, we have specular reflections, which for the most part is screen space reflections. As you can see, see it's adding things like trees in the distance and stuff like that. For the most part, on very low, we lose a lot of quality in reflections, and low is good enough. If we crank this up, the reflections only get higher quality for the most part. I'd recommend having this on low, if not medium. Everything above this doesn't seem to add too much really at all. Between medium and very high, there's not too much of a difference. High, for some reason, seems to have a bit more contrast. Anyways, medium is probably good enough here. Diffuse reflections, if we quickly click through these, you'll see there's barely any difference, to be honest, but as you can see, it's supposed to have effects on rough surfaces done by ray tracing. Well, I guess this game does have ray tracing, and it's in specific options such as this one here. Usually enabling anything ray tracing costs you a ton of performance, and it's no different here. I'd recommend leaving this set to low, as there's practically no difference with how things look, except for maybe a little bit when you get too high, but for the most part, this is a completely unnoticeable effect, and anything ray tracing is going to completely destroy your FPS. Have this set to low. Environment reflection quality, if we click between these, there's only a few differences. Small objects and small shadows seem to be forgotten when this is pushed to low, and for the most part, you're not going to notice any kind of difference here, especially as you'll probably be looking through glass and things like this anyways. Low is good enough, but if you can handle it, high is going to add a little bit more detail, making the game feel a bit more lifelike. Volumetric effects, clouds, as we click between these, you'll see there's not too much of a difference for the most part during normal gameplay, but medium is a good middle ground. High is just a bit extra. There's not really anything new added to the scene. Low just makes the clouds look a bit mushy and roadblocksy. Medium is good enough here, and that's where I'd leave mine. Volumetric fog, when it's raining and foggy and things like that, this option is going to have an effect on how the overall game is perceived. If we push this across to Ultra, apply settings, and head back to the actual game itself, you can see what Ultra looks like. Cranking volumetric fog to very low, I think we lost some detail, but for the most part, there's no real difference. We're sitting at a solid 58-60 FPS, and on very high, we're sitting at 55. This is quite an expensive effect, and to be honest, it doesn't really add anything at all, at least in this current scene where there's lots of fog. For this reason, for a small FPS gain, I'd leave this on very low and pretty much forget about it. Low or medium is probably good enough. I set this to medium. We should have a good compromise between FPS and quality, and yes, we do. We're at 58-60, which is pretty much the same as having this on very low, just we should have a bit better quality. Then scrolling past volumetric effects, we have world detail. Extra streaming distance. This means that objects further into the distance will have their higher quality models and textures loaded. I'd recommend leaving this where this is, but if you have more VRAM available, you can crank this higher. In the bottom right, you can see a VRAM estimate. I'm currently using 8.4 out of my total of 12, and there's about 2 gigabytes being used by Windows, which I assume is this purple over here. The game currently being used, cyan and white, I assume, is how much is left over for the game to take or possibly in reserve. Leaving this at around 5 is good enough. You can crank it higher if objects are popping into their higher quality textures and models a bit too close to you and it's somewhat noticeable. 5 is a good setting. Object detail is the level of detail for things nearby you. I'd recommend leaving this where this is. You can crank this higher if you have tons of extra VRAM, but the visual impact is probably going to be negligible compared to 15, which is the default, to be honest. So I'd probably leave it right about where it is, if not push it up a few clicks. BVH quality has to do with ray tracing, and if we click between these, there's very minimal impact. I'd recommend just leaving this low. Micro detail quality has to do with grass and textures like that. As you can see, if we push too low, tons of foliage disappears and makes the world feel a lot less alive. On medium, tons of this reappears, and between medium, high, and ultra, there's a few changes. High has a few more, and ultra doesn't really do anything except for a bit of moss and trees and adds a bit more depth to the environment. As this is more of a scenic game than a Call of Duty, I'd recommend having this option set all the way up to high if possible, if not ultra for that extra pizzazz, but high really is good enough here. Medium and especially low takes away far too much from the world, and if you have the resources available, I'd highly recommend leaving this on high, if not ultra, just for the immersive experience. Then particle detail. If we click between these, you can see there's not too much of a difference between very low, low, and medium. High, however, has a huge amount of particles moving all over the place. This I don't think has to do with the actual setting here. I think these things are just stuck to this log or whatever it is, and suddenly in the final screenshot they've been agitated or they've taken off. I don't think it'll have this much of an impact in gameplay, so these pictures are probably a bit misleading, but clicking through these there's barely any difference. Low adds a bit of foggy / shadowy texture, medium adds a few more embers floating around, and high apparently adds a lot, but to be honest I think it's just the screenshot messing up. If you can, I'd leave it on high, as particles and things like that have a huge impact on how alive the game feels. Otherwise, if you're struggling for FPS, you can turn this down. Then scatter density. This has to do with, once again, foliage, and as you can see between ultra and low, the environment just looks a lot better when this is cranked to the higher end. We lose a lot of the grass texture on the left of the little river here, moving between ultra down to high, and everything below high, there's not too much of a difference other than shadows here and there, becoming more noticeable as grass disappears and certain objects move around. For the most part, high looks really good and ultra looks way better. I'd recommend leaving this at ultra if possible, otherwise you can lower this. Dither fade has to do with objects fading out of view or becoming a bit blurry when you're moving past them. I'd recommend leaving this on for a better gameplay experience, as you can see through things more easily, but you can turn this off if you wish. Then finally, textures. In here, spotlight projection resolution. Clicking between these, it once again mostly has to do with shadows. 256 has a good compromise for performance and looks. 512, if you have the available VRAM, is what I'd recommend you leave it on if you can handle it. Then destruction quality has to do with walls and things like that falling apart. For the most part, moving between these should add more particles and bits when things explode or fall apart, so having it set to the higher end results in a more cinematic, better looking experience, and I'd recommend leaving it as high as possible here. If you find that you drop tons of FPS when things break apart, this is the option you'll need to come back and lower. Finally, terrain tessellation. This has to do with how detailed the terrain geometry is, and for the most part, clicking between ultra and low, there's not too much of a difference here, but I'm pretty sure that while you're running around the world, you'll notice the difference looking a bit closer at the ground texture and how everything looks. Leaving this on high, if not ultra, is probably what we'll be doing. I'll set this to ultra, apply my settings, head back to the actual game itself. You can see we're sitting at a solid 58-ish FPS. If we pause and drop this option to low, we're suddenly at a 59, 60-ish. Well, it's jumping around a bit more, but to be honest, there's practically no difference here other than maybe 1 FPS. I'd recommend leaving this option to the higher end, as if you're someone who doesn't stay on the beating path, it's probably something you'll notice a small difference between. Having it set to ultra, if not high, is probably what you'll want. For the most part, we've now been through all of the settings here, and while 60 FPS may not seem too crazy, remember we are at 2K resolution. There is a ton of weather going on at the moment in-game, and of course, this is still a new game. Updating your graphics card driver, for example, should give you a huge performance increase if you haven't done that in quite a while, and of course, closing other programs and processes in the background, etc. If you find that you need extra performance, I'd recommend messing around with the DLSS or FSR quality in your options, moving it from ultra quality to quality, for example. So I'll stand here, we're getting a solid 45-ish, I'll pause, and on the video tab, moving my scaling quality from ultra to just quality, you can see we're now at 48-ish, 50, so we gained a handful of FPS, while the game hasn't changed too much in how it looks. Between ultra quality and quality, you're not going to lose too much texture and detail and stuff like that, but anything lower than this, you probably will start to notice the effects of FSR3 or just upscaling in general. For the most part, this really isn't bad at all. The game still does have quite a way to go with optimization. Obviously, this game just released today, so there is going to be a ton more effort and work put in, or at least hopefully. So if the game isn't up to your standards for now, it probably will be at some stage in the future. It is a really beautiful, well, good-looking game with, as I can see, a few ray tracing options. It'd be great to have a cyberpunk type example where really immersive and high-quality ray tracing settings are available, and of course, some way of changing the weather. I'd probably have to play for quite a few more minutes for the weather to change, but for the most part, you've got a really hard look at how the game performs, at least in demanding situations, which is pretty good. It gives you a realistic look at how the game is going to perform, or probably for you. Anyways, if I drop the game to 1080p, I'd probably gain a ton of FPS, but for the most part, 50-ish FPS is good enough, especially for a single-player game that's based off a movie. You'll probably want a more realistic, higher quality looking game anyways. Now that we're finally done with everything, I'll move back up to ultra quality, pause the game, settings, video, and I'll make sure to enable frame rate limiting to lock it to slightly below the FPS we're getting. So for example, I don't know, 40-ish FPS here in this current scene, though for the most part you'll probably be getting more than this. And you should notice programs in the background suddenly get extra performance, where previously they were probably being paused and held back quite a lot. If I were to enable frame generation, you'd see my FPS numbers skyrocket, but unfortunately, I don't think I'll be able to do that with my frame overlay hooked and probably even recording. But anyways, you get the gist of it. That's really about it for this quick optimization guide. This game still does have quite a bit of optimization left to do out of the box, but for the most part, it really doesn't look or feel that bad. I think ultra quality is a bit too high for me. Quality is probably where we'll want to keep it. Yeah, things feel a lot better. Anyways, thank you all for watching. My name's been Troubleshoot. Hopefully this video helped you, and hopefully you get a playable frame rate if you don't have super new hardware. Anyways, thank you all for watching. My name's been Troubleshoot, and I'll see you all next time. Ciao. And quickly, a special thank you to KZ, my first Ultimate supporter.